to all of you and to the Rockefeller Institute for hosting this forum. It's really a pleasure to be with you all. My hope is that I'll be able to keep my remarks short and that we'll have a chance at the end of this panel to have a good conversation. And I know Don is really itching for EJ and myself to have some kind of all-out battle on this. But anyone else who wants to join in that mud wrestling match really is totally welcome to join in, because what's the point of being here on a lovely rainy November afternoon if we can't have get into a good debate about some of this stuff. I thought I would talk briefly, I guess, first of all, on the question of whether now is a good time to be having this conversation about revenues. It's certainly a time of a lot of uncertainty in a lot of state capitals. I think sort of implicit in this conversation is the fact that it is, but I'll walk through why I think that's the case. Then talk about some of the principles and maybe some of the strategies for addressing the revenue side of the equation in the coming year or two. And then I want to talk briefly about the federal role, because there's been some discussion in the backdrop of this panel of this conference about the federal aid to states that was in the Recovery Act, about the Medicaid program, sort of other issues of federal and state responsibilities. So I want to talk a little bit about the federal role essentially the federal government as a source of revenue for states in the short term and a little bit going forward. The reasons I think now is a good time for this conversation are sort of threefold, I guess. One is that this is a debate that is about to really kick in. It has been going on in state capitals. We're probably about to kick in an even greater degree in the coming year because of the high likelihood, because of the threat that is posed to the services that state and local governments provide. Others have said it earlier. I'll just repeat it, that the vast majority of state spending is state and local tax dollars go to pay for education, transportation, health care, public safety. All things. David Walker alluded earlier to the fact that a lot of what the federal government does isn't enumerated in the federal Constitution. I would argue that a lot of what state governments does is alluded to in the preamble of the Constitution under the headings of promoting the general welfare and securing the blessings of liberty. And I remember that out of the top of my head. Thank you, Schoolhouse Rock. These are all things that folks think are important to themselves and to their families, and that there's a pretty substantial body of evidence are important to medium and long-term economic growth in this country. And in addition, during a recession, and a deep recession with high unemployment, rising poverty, there's a special role for state and local funded programs, from health care for people who have lost their jobs or can't afford employer-provided insurance, to funding for local soup kitchens and food banks, to the administrative costs associated even with 100% federally funded programs like food stamps. These are all functions of state governments, of local governments, funded by taxes that are even more important and by extension even more costly in a recession than other times. So I think the fact that spending, state general fund spending, has fallen by 4 to 5% over each of the last 2 fiscal years, as the National Association of State Budget Officers has found, is a real concern and is having real effects on services and on families and on the economy. The second big reason to talk about this at this time, of course, about revenues, is that revenues have plummeted, as Don and others have pointed out. And so we've got this weird disconnect between revenues and costs. And yes, perhaps as a culture over time, we are not paying for everything we receive. But the disconnect now in this recession with year-over-year revenue changes as much as 17%, that disconnect is even greater. And it really suggests that what we face right now, at least in the short term, is a revenue problem, not a spending problem, but a revenue problem. And that suggests that at least part of the solution needs to come on the revenue side, as well as on the spending side. I mean, the state and local workforce over the last 15 or so months has fallen by about 190,000 jobs. And that's at all suggesting that states aren't or shouldn't be cutting spending. But I think part of the solution, this conversation needs to be about revenues. And then I think the third reason now is a good time is that maybe unlike the lieutenant governor, I actually don't think we're going to be at this sort of 20% down level of revenues forever. I learned from reading the recent Moody's report on the New York State bonds that there is some expectation that Wall Street is going to start paying bonuses again this year. Now, I may not wish that they would start paying bonuses again, but if they are, it does suggest that New York State revenues may start to come back to some degree. And I think the same is true in other states. I don't know how long it will take. It may be 4 or 5 years before revenues come all the way back, but there will be a recovery. What happens when, and what if you watch state tax actions in good times and bad, is that states raise taxes during recessions and in the wake of recessions, and then when a recovery starts, states start cutting taxes. And before we put ourselves right back on that roller coaster again, maybe we want to think a little bit about what we want the net effect of the tax increases and the next round of tax cuts to be. How can we avoid a situation where in the next recession we're not kicking ourselves for all the revenue that was given away in the form of tax cuts during the past recovery? So what should states do in terms of revenue options? What are the possibilities? Well, I think there's sort of three basic principles that states are going to be looking at in the next couple of years as they think about tinkering with their tax systems or fundamentally changing their tax systems. And the first is so obvious, I probably don't even need to say it, but it's be revenue positive. I mean, I think the size of the hole that most states face is so big that the cuts-only solution is unrealistic, irresponsible. I think all states are and should be looking for revenue solutions to address at least part of their budget gap. I think a second key principle of any tax package needs to be, to the extent possible, to protect the most vulnerable. I think state and local tax systems are regressive, do depend heavily on taxes paid by low and moderate income families, heavily reliant on consumption taxes, and so I think a look to both progressive sources of taxation, or to the extent that you have to look at regressive sources of taxation in order to raise enough revenue, thinking about offsetting mechanisms that can protect the lowest income families, protect people with disabilities, protect the newly unemployed, is worth taking seriously. And then I think third is where we get into the long term, and what Bob really wanted me to talk about, which is the long-term sustainability and stability of tax systems. And I think this has a number of components, both in terms of specific policies and then in terms of budgetary mechanisms, which I think are also a key part of the long-term future. In terms of policy options, Don sort of alluded to probably most of them, and many of you, if you paid any attention in state and local public finance classes, know what they are. I mean, continue to fight the rearguard battle against the erosion of the corporate income tax through combined reporting, which New York did a few years ago, and a number of states have yet to do. Hold on to three-factor apportionment to the extent possible. Look hard at various kinds of alternative minimum taxes. A lot of states haven't changed those in decades, and those can be updated and get some more revenue from there. Decouple from some of the bad ideas in corporate taxation that the federal government had the wisdom to enact in the last few years, like the domestic production deduction. I think broadening the sales tax base is sort of a no-brainer. It is the major consumption tax we have in this country. And again, both in the area of services, particularly household services or services that are used by both households and businesses. Not the politically easiest thing to do, but certainly a necessary thing to do. And I think addressing the internet sales problem, is important, and while we are waiting for the real solution, which is for the federal government to act to give states the power to tax retail sales made over the internet in order to keep the playing field level for bricks and mortar businesses and internet businesses, there are self-help things that states can do, like New York's Amazon law that allows New York to collect sales taxes on purchases to New York residents, and is really a model for the country. I think income tax progressivity is important to hold on to, and a lot of states actually need to do more of that. A progressive income tax rises faster in good times, and the revenue from it falls faster in bad times. So it needs to be accompanied by other sorts of mechanisms, which we'll talk about in just a minute, to ensure that when the recession comes along, states are protected from the worst of that fall off. But given the fundamental change in the economy in this country over the last several decades towards one where an increasing share of income is concentrated among a fairly small percentage, a fairly tiny percentage, at the top, it's irresponsible of states not to look at a progressive income tax as a source of revenue. I didn't really understand the interaction between Howard and Don about the cost of tax breaks for seniors. So I'm almost hesitant to mention this one until I know what they're talking about. But I do think that increasingly tax breaks, broad tax breaks for seniors that don't take into account that aren't means tested or otherwise targeted are going to be increasingly costly for states, and scaling those back is a reasonable thing states can do. And then I think revenue options for local governments is also important, given the whipsawing that we haven't talked much about local governments, but given the whipsawing that they've taken in this property tax crash, I think it's important that we think beyond states that haven't done so already. We need to think beyond the property tax as a source of revenue. David Walker talked about moving from Fairfax, Virginia to Bridgeport, Connecticut, and seeing his property taxes go way up. What he didn't mention is that in Fairfax, Virginia, they got a sales tax, which is helping pay for the schools there, and they're looking at a meals tax to help close their school budget there. And Connecticut has, I think, fewer sources of local government revenue. Those are some of the ideas. I also think mechanisms, multi-year budgeting, so that when we enact these tax measures for positive or for negative, we can see what is the out-year impact. It's one thing to enact any policy on the spending side of the tax side, another thing not to know what's it going to cost. I think stronger policies that prioritize deposits into a rainy day fund, where in those boom years, when there are big Wall Street bonuses, when revenues come in at a very high level, part of that gets socked away into a rainy day fund that is available for the time when those revenues are not there anymore. Mandatory review of tax expenditures, some kind of mechanisms that I think Oregon just passed a law that requires the legislature to take a very serious look at whether tax expenditures are continuing to do the job that they were put in place for. Just the same, exactly the same, no less than what you would do for expenditures on the spending side of the budget. And these kinds of mechanisms, are much better than the rigid sort of formula-based caps, property tax caps or Tabor or whatever, that a number of states have played with and have gotten a number of states in trouble during this recession. And we can talk more about those in the Q&A session if folks want. And then just say briefly about what really is now, I think, the fourth leg of the proverbial three-legged stool of state and local governments, which is revenue from the federal government. We did away with revenue sharing a long time ago, but an underappreciated aspect of the Recovery Act was that it provides enough more direct funding for fairly relatively general purposes, education and healthcare, in the form of increased Medicaid grants and a new state fiscal stabilization fund, to the point where federal grants are now actually larger than any of the quote-unquote big three sources of revenue for states and localities: the sales tax, the income tax, the property tax. And part of that's because the federal money was going up, and part of that's because the state and local revenue was going down. They sort of met and crossed like ships in the night. And I think, this was done partly so that states could preserve services, but mostly for macroeconomic purposes to reduce the extent to which states otherwise would be cutting back payments to private sector vendors, laying off public employees, enacting tax increases, all of which would reduce aggregate demand at a time when the economy was in a lot of trouble. And I actually think there's a very strong case and a reasonable chance, although I'm not sure I would yet put it about 50%, that federal fiscal, that there will be another round of federal aid to states. I think as Congress looks at what can they do to make sure we don't slip back into recession, the problems that have been discussed here that states are going to be facing when it comes time to write the budgets for fiscal year 2011 are going to acquire increased salience. We already have seen reports that the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund is paying for a little over 300,000 jobs. I've seen some new studies that suggest that a moderate extension of fiscal relief could increase employment relative to what otherwise would be a year or so from now by 350, 400, 450,000 jobs. These are numbers that get Congress's attention. They make sense. They are pretty much straight out of the macroeconomic playbook. And honestly, this is something that ought to be happening automatically. And if we look ahead to sort of the next recession or the recession after that, I think there's a very strong case to say we should have things that provide additional federal aid during recessions that happen automatically. I mean, if we have universal health care, for instance, or near universal health care, if states are bearing a big chunk of the cost for providing this health insurance to the poor, to people with incomes below a certain level, and if during a recession states are expected to provide that insurance to the rising number of people who have incomes below provide that care to people who have incomes below that level, then sort of by definition there needs to be some mechanism for the federal government to step in during those times, because state revenues will be going down, the number of people to provide care for will be going up, and you get a sort of fundamental flaw in this new system. So I think counter-cyclical assistance going forward is going to be even more important than it has been today. None of which, of course, obviates the need for states to act. I mean, if the federal government does extend fiscal relief, it's only going to fill a portion of the whole, maybe a third of the budget gap. And I certainly think Congress is looking for states to demonstrate some ability and willingness to take it on themselves to solve these problems. We heard a lot during the last congressional debate about fiscal relief. We heard a lot about the moral hazard problem. The idea, well, if the federal government comes in and reduces the size of state budget shortfalls, that reduces the incentive for states to solve it themselves. And so I think in response to that, I think Congress never will do anything that would fill even a majority of state budget gaps. And I think it would be very wise policy for states to do a lot to manage their finances better. So in the form of, for instance, increased reserve funds, so that the gaps are not as big next time. So I will end with that, and again, really look forward to questions and discussion. Thanks.
I guess I'm next, and to begin with, I hate to disappoint Don Boyd more than anything else in the world. But I'm going to be incredibly self-disciplined, and I'm not talking about taxes, as I've been asked not to do. I will, however, at the risk of shocking Don and Nick, say that I'm not opposed to broadening consumption tax bases. I think probably where we would differ is on the rate, and also on the way New York and some other states have kind of done this Amazon tax in a way that has unintended and inequitable consequences for some people. But beyond that, again, at the risk of disappointing Don, I'm going to get into my discussion, which poses the magical question, long-term budget gaps, are there any solutions? And the answer is yes, there are, although none of them are considered easy or, for that matter, even feasible in the eyes of many state legislators who I think still haven't actually awakened to the full brunt of the problem they're facing. I'd like to start by creating a context. Now, Kim Rubin did this in more detail and in more long-term detail in her presentation earlier. I'm just quickly establishing, in the shorter term, some nominal comparisons just to kind of frame the discussion of where states have been very recently so we can talk about where they're headed. This is from the last trough, economically and fiscally, in 2003 through fiscal 2008, the last peak for most places. State general fund expenditures were up 36%. They grew faster than the overall economy, which grew exceptionally strongly during that period, 32%, and grew at more than twice the CPI inflation rate. However, despite that very strong growth in state expenditures as measured by NASBO, the Association of State Budget Officers, by the end of that period, states also were reporting the largest general fund balances ever recorded by NASBO. Now again, states differ. This is going to be an ongoing theme of our discussion, of course, is that states differ and are often more different, as different as they are alike. And state budget accounting is not necessarily a reliable thing. But as reported to NASBO, the Association of State Budget Officers, state fund balances in 2006 were over 11.5%. On the verge of this recession, they were still around 8%. Even New York, including some of the unofficial money that John Cape had socked away in the budget, when Eliot Spitzer took office, New York had a fund balance probably approaching 8% of its general fund. That's much higher than the fund balances or surpluses, if you want to call them that states had during previous fiscal crisis periods. So even with all this spending, they had in effect, if unofficially, on average, accumulated rainy day funds, if you want to call them that, much larger than they had ever had before, and most of which have disappeared fast. Now, one thing Don mentioned, and this is really striking because when I was preparing for this talk, I looked at the actual budget documents in many other large and medium-sized states, and I hadn't done that much before, and I really was struck to agree with Don about how good New York's long-term financial plan is compared to those of most other states. And that's why I'm using this chart as an illustration, in part because it's one of the few states where you can even construct this chart. And again, I think a tip of the cap to John Cape and his immediate predecessors, because our financial plan has gotten steadily more transparent over the years. It's also gotten thicker and thicker, so it's almost impossible to pick it up. But I use New York's figures to illustrate a syndrome that I think is at work in many places. And Don also mentioned this. In the long term, even in the midterm, and here is where I will disagree with Nick Johnson to a certain extent. In the short term right now, states have a revenue problem. Their revenues now are cratering. But the overall problem, I think, looks similar to this in many states. And that is the red line on that chart is spending. The blue line is revenues. Now, that's a blue line of revenues that I think includes a not unreasonable expectation of those financial sector bonuses that we were talking about earlier. Next year alone, with the stimulus still in the budget, next fiscal year, New York State's current law baseline spending is up 10.4% with the stimulus in the budget. I call that mainly a spending problem, not an expenditure problem. In the out year, where our out year gap is now roughly $19 billion, did some quick calculations looking at my financial plan earlier. In line with kind of what the portrayal of the national situation, 4.6 billion of that gap is Medicaid, 4.6 billion is school aid, 2 billion is what New York calls general state charges, which is principally pension costs and health insurance costs for employees, and the rest is everything else. And again, not knowing all of the other states in detail and unable to even create this chart for some of the major states that might have been interesting, I suspect that the national figures we've seen and some of the ones that Kim reviewed would tend to support the view that other states are facing similar situations. One big difference is New York just enacted a very significant set of tax and fee increases, the largest combined tax and fee increase in absolute terms ever, and even in relative terms, it rivaling the largest it's ever done. And that's what the chart looks like after that action. Now, we talked about Medicaid and education. Before I even get to that slide, this is, I'm not trying to be cute here, but I mean, we could either have an entire conference about Medicaid, or we can talk about other ways of reducing the expenditure side of the budget. But And I would ask you to have mercy in the sense that I'm somebody from New York State, and my perspective on Medicaid is so incredibly skewed that by a system that is more expensive and more expansive in every conceivable direction than the norm, that trying to adapt what I know about New York's Medicaid system to the national level probably wouldn't be worth our time. Suffice to say, Medicaid's a huge problem. Healthcare costs in general are a huge problem. They need to be controlled one way or another, with or without the assistance of the federal government. They are at least a third to a half of the near-term and long-term problem for all states. And the difference between New York, say, and Iowa is probably one of degree more than anything else. That aside, then there's the education issue. K-12 is a big piece of every budget. K-12 politically is close to the hearts of lawmakers everywhere, even in places where typically K-12 spending and K-12 aid is a tiny fraction, again, of what we're used to seeing here in the Northeast, in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. What we're seeing swelling education spending in recent years, as revenues skyrocketed in the late 90s, interrupted by the dip earlier in the decade, and again in recent years, what have states done? They've taken programs that are very staff intensive, and they have basically added, even as enrollments flattened or dipped in many places, they've added new features to those programs. It's not just federal mandates. Preschool, universal pre-K, and all-day kindergarten, for example, have been popular in many states and have been major causes of education spending increases. Education is very labor intensive, education is salary and benefit intensive, and that leads to my next area, which is, as I said, even in New York's case, which spends a ton on Medicaid and education, that everything else is not a negligible portion of the budget. And so that's a bit of what I'm going to concentrate on. Also, I think states need to view their budgets as on a global basis. And they have to keep in mind the needs and concerns of their local governments, the downstream entities, as well as their own immediate situation. Because in virtually every state, local governments are subject to state statutes that determine who they can hire, what the circumstances under which they hire them, the nature of the contractual relationship between local governments and employees, procurement issues, organizational merger or non-merger issues. These are all ultimately controlled by state law to a greater or lesser degree around the country. And as states address this budget crisis, they need to keep that in mind. So what I'm about to say goes for states need to consider in the context of their local government problems that are being created, as well as their own immediate budget gaps. Point one, reform and restructure employee compensation. Most states are locked into outmoded civil service systems that increasingly are mismatched with the way the rest of the world operates. Large corporate organizations, to which they're most analogous, do not operate the way state governments operate. And they need to explore ways of adapting more flexible work arrangements, and including incentive-based pay structure that actually offers many employees more upside based on performance. Now again, given the caveat that all states differ, as I'm painfully aware here in New York, or as we are, some states are more tied down by collective bargaining, a combination of collective bargaining and civil service rules than other states are. But to the extent states have freedom to do this, they need to do it either with management in the lead or working with their unions as much as they possibly can. Next, retirement benefit plans. We spoke about this earlier. I'm going to part company with some of what was said earlier. I don't think the situation with pension benefits is as bad as it's been portrayed. I think it's much, much, much worse than it's been portrayed. Underscore much. And I'm not kidding. If you follow the debate in this area, all public defined benefit public pension plans are based and calculated on the basis of an accounting fallacy. They are discounted. Their future liabilities are discounted on the basis of their target rate of return. That is not only a fallacy, it goes to outright falsehood. It's not permitted in the private sector. It's very, very misleading. And if you want an example of what it means, the city of New York, alone among major jurisdictions and employers in the public sector, has begun over the past few years through its actuary, who's the best in the country in the public sector, to report the alternative calculation of what its pension liability is if calculated on the basis of an actual market rate of interest. As of 2 or 3 years ago, right before the market tanked, at a time when the city's largest pension fund was technically under GASB rules fully funded, that calculation indicated that the pension fund was actually 40% underfunded. Now, I'm not talking about Illinois here, or New Jersey, or Massachusetts, many of the localities in Massachusetts, or other places that have severe pension problems. The underfunded liability, unfunded liability for pension systems nationwide has been estimated in a recent study at $2 trillion. That's not the number you saw earlier, which is what the liability is. That's the unfunded liability. The unfunded retiree health care liability is more than $1 trillion. Those things can be addressed. You can't tackle and confront this defined benefit cost overhang, this legacy cost, in the right way unless you close the plans. And DC for too long has been regarded, defined contribution plans, as unthinkable. We're sitting here in the middle of a public sector institution of higher education, or one of its offshoots, all over the country for 40 or 50 years. The whole public sector in higher ed has been in a defined contribution plan, or rather has had the option and has largely opted into it. We have to adopt that thinking to the public sector. It does not solve the problem. What it does is it recognizes the problem for what it is, which is an immense long-term debt that we've created for our children and grandchildren, and we have to do a workout of. But that's what it is. And the step one is close the plan. Step two is calculate the actual liability. And step three is figure out how to fund it over the long term, because it's a nightmare. Now, practically speaking, in terms of how to work toward expenditure savings in the rest of government, again, because I think that they're too often we neglect what we call in New York the state operations side of government. The operational side of administrative agencies, because we assume, well, Medicaid and education, they're just so big we can't even think about this. However, there are approaches to be used that I think are helpful ways of thinking about it. In fact, what I'm about to describe to you, Lieutenant Governor Ravitch more or less paraphrased as the approach he hoped to take in the study that he's going to have underway through the Rockefeller Institute of a long-term workout plan, if you will, in New York. The framework used in the state of Washington was called Priorities of Government, or POG. By the way, it was an approach that was suggested by a conservative think tank in Washington, a counterpart roughly to my organization, to a Democratic governor who adopted it and used it successfully to close what was, in the state of Washington's context, a fairly large budget gap in 2003. And it really, this is not brain surgery, as they say. These are fairly obvious questions that should be asked about the way government operates, but too often are not asked in a systematic way. They're up there. What's the revenue? Well, that's question one. What are the essential services the state must deliver? How will the state measure its progress in accomplishing the goals? Key question, as Mr. Walker pointed out, not asked on the federal level and almost unasked completely on the state level around the country. What's the most effective way to accomplish those goals? And again, if it's a core function, what level of government should provide it? And how can we bring market forces and competition into play? Yes, I'm going to mention outsourcing. However, government, states, and localities shouldn't even think about outsourcing until they begin to adopt a way to think about outsourcing and to think about the price of what they do and how they do it. There's been prototypes for this created both on the federal level under the A76 circular that dates back in its antecedents to the Bush 1 era and was adopted largely under Clinton. The state of Virginia has done it particularly well among states. You create a council to conduct an inventory of services and activities. You establish priorities for what areas you think that can be competitively outsourced, that is, with in-house work teams competing against possible outside contractors. You develop an accounting model for actually determining what your fully allocated and unit cost is. And when you have all those things in place, then you can have a system for productively exploring this option. Fear not one-shots. I won't get into that more. That's actually a slide almost intended for reporters who've been so indoctrinated in the awfulness of one-shots. They'll look at any plan with one-shots and say, that must be awful. Obviously, if a one-shot is hardwired to some longer-term solution that takes time to produce savings, it's not necessarily a bad thing, even if it's an enormous one-shot. There need to be clear goals. This is, I think, a place where we're in unanimous agreement. You have to be thinking of near-term and long-term as well as the short-term. Everybody needs to strive for stable and sustainable finances. I do disagree on the rainy day fund issue. I don't think a rainy day fund has been invented that actually eliminates these problems at times like this. And I think we've just seen that based on the numbers I recited earlier. Memo to Washington, hold the stimulus too, please. The first stimulus was no favor. It did prop up the status quo in many places. It certainly did in New York. If you insist on stimulus to eliminate categorical restrictions like the ones established with the FMAP expansion of Medicaid reimbursements, attach strings designed to ensure the funds are used to engineer a transition to the kind of sustainable, stable budget I mentioned earlier, and above all, don't pass the buck on health care. Now it may be too late even as we sit here. It seems to be a question of how much they'll pass and not whether they will. But obviously that's a tremendous blow to states if they do that. I want to close. This is my cheeky attempt at provocation on one level. The IMF, the chief economist for the IMF did a report that was extremely influential, I think, in shaping stimulus programs in countries around the world, including here in the United States, last December, when the panic was still almost at fever pitch. One point they made in there that didn't get enough attention, if any attention, was public sector wage increases should be avoided, as they are not well targeted, difficult to reverse, and similar to transfers in their effectiveness. I can tell you that with very little doubt that in New York State, as I suspect in more than a few states, but not all, virtually every penny of that stimulus funding that went into propping up school aid in New York served to make possible average pay increases in the range of 5% in New York State public school districts. So what we did was expand the base of compensation costs for another year, stimulated nothing, and enabled everybody to delay confronting their core problems. And I would suggest that that's not the right approach to take for the future, and look forward to our discussion of this beyond that.
And I was afraid there wasn't going to be anything to discuss. Just one note, EJ had some kind things to say about the transparency of the budget division, which I think is absolutely true. And as you go around the country, as I do now, all of the information that New York puts out I haven't seen replicated anyplace else. But my responsibility for it is really not well placed. And as I was looking around the room while you were talking, I did see the father of transparency in New York State budgeting is with us today. And it started back in the early 90s when the budget division was able to slip stuff into the back of the books because who looks there? We were able to start putting things in, and then found sort of a willing partner in Governor Pataki in the middle of the 1990s. But the person that was a colossal pain in the ass for transparency from that day to this day is with us, and that is John Traylor, who currently works for the Office of the State Controller, is the architect of all of the budget. So we had a spirited discussion here of whether or not this is a spending problem or a revenue problem, and I would just throw out one factoid for people to consider. If you look at the spending trend line of Medicaid and school aid in New York, and then you look at with a fairly rosy set of glasses, the production of our revenue system, and that is with revenue growth annually above the rate of personal income. So in the 5 to 6% revenue growth. By somewhere between 2020 and 2025, Medicaid and school aid will consume the entire general fund of the state of New York. There won't be any room for transportation, corrections, mental health, general government, tax, anything else. And that leads me to suggest that in New York, it's mostly a spending problem. I was struck by something as Dean Saltzman was unfortunate enough to be getting coffee. And I watched him out there looking for coffee. And he got a coffee cup. And he went to the first, there's a whole bunch of coffee thermoses lined up. He went to the first one and pushed on the pump, it was empty. He immediately went to the next one and pushed on it, it was empty. He went down the row of coffee pumps until he found one that had coffee in it, and he pumped that until his coffee cup was full. And you see that phenomenon played out in governments. If you look at schools, schools largely rely upon state transfers and upon the property tax. Now that it's certainly in the downstate area, property taxes hit sort of a practical limit on Long Island. School property taxes, well, all property taxes are more than 8% of the median personal household income. And over the next like 20 years, that number will double or triple. But as they hit that threshold where there was a lot of resistance to the property tax, they migrated into more intense effort to get state transfers and have done pretty well over the last 5 to 7 years. Local governments hit that same property tax threshold, migrated into the sales tax and relied more heavily on the sales tax. Now you're finding that schools are sort of up against the practical limit on property taxes and are facing a state government without the resources to meet their revenue growth demands. And so, you know, they're sort of in crisis. Local governments became more reliant on the sales tax and are now the victims of the volatility that comes with that, as opposed to the good old plain vanilla property tax that's pretty steady eddy. It doesn't rise, it doesn't fall. And so there's a lot of friction that's going to take place. A lot of the catalyst for change is there isn't another ready source to migrate to in terms of fueling spending, and maybe that is going to be the catalyst for some innovation that's long overdue. I tend to agree with Nick that there is probably another round of stimulus. You have only to look at the Cash for Clunkers program. $1 billion, that's it. We all mean it. We all said it. And when we started to run out of money, Congress folded like the proverbial lawn chair and added $2 billion more. And then there was the first-time home buyer program. Hard stop on November 30th. We all said it. We all admitted it. We signed an oath in blood in Washington. And now we have first-time home buyers and every other home buyer extensions of those programs. I think, you know, Congress is going to be scared blind next summer. And that there will be another round of stimulus. And one of the things that I'd like to throw out for discussion is whether we think that's a good or a bad thing. It's certainly, you know, EJ makes the argument that it is just sort of propping up this unsustainable governmental delivery system, whereas, you know, Nick would argue, it seems to me, that, you know, it's more of a bridge toward a return to economic growth and the recovery of the economic engine that produces the tax revenue to finance it on itself. A couple of other thoughts, and then we'll get to that discussion. One is, as I've looked around New York State, think about this, almost no level of government exclusively performs any service. If you look, you know, almost everybody plows roads. Almost everybody has cops. Almost everybody has human services in one fashion or another. And, you know, you see those layers exemplified in a lot of the federal programs that have driven the migration from the hard side infrastructure emphasis of states in the 50s and early 60s into the predominant social services side now. Many of those programs, like Medicaid, like TANF, like child welfare programs, all of the Title IV programs that drive so much of the policy and focus in states, are federally regulated, and then the federal government gives money to the states, and the states administer these programs. And those and that administration then translates that money down to local governments in New York, mostly counties. And counties then deliver those services, but oftentimes through a fourth layer, which is not-for-profit providers. So you've got all of these layers touching the federal dollar that makes its way from the federal home office to the regional office to the state agency that regulates it, down to the county that then pushes it out to individual providers before that federal dollar actually gets to the actual service recipient. And that, I think, sort of reflects a lot of the marble cake matrix that we have now that I think it's going to be difficult to sustain going forward. But let me sort of come back then to this notion and see if there's any interest in the audience in discussing whether more federal stimulus is a good or bad thing, and whether or not there's a change in the way it should be done. Are we okay on time? In the way it should be done that promotes less layering of the money between, and less transmission loss of it between the federal government and the ultimate recipient. So any comments, good or bad? Yeah.
I've been listening today, and I didn't expect to think this. I think you can put together a lot. This is a very interesting day. A lot of things people have said to suggest that Dick Ravitch said this, and David Walker said it in spades. We're in a new era. We're going to do grand new big things. And I didn't think this when I entered the room. And I think, John, you put your finger right on it, which is that we've often gone through periods where we look at federalism and think about sorting out functions and looking at revenues and responsibilities in new ways. And I'm an old conservative. I don't think, Burkean conservative, that is. I think you got to be careful when you change things in big ways. But as I listen today, my mind's been opened up to, John, what you're suggesting, which others have suggested today, which is maybe this is bigger than I thought, in that there can be some really large-scale creativity about how we assign functions and implementation and revenue responsibilities in the domestic public sector. That is, I didn't expect to say. So, Bob, you did a good job. You provoked the hell out of me. And John suggested, and you asked for comments, and that's mine.
Ordinarily, you'd say with a stimulus that you don't want to put rules on it. You just want the money to get spent well. But I think that EJ puts his finger on the right issue. The issue really is expense. But if it's really about expense, the only way you're ever going to get to the expense is to address the revenue. Because the revenue, and it's not just the Wall Street revenue that supported New York, it's the entire wealth of the United States that supported us to spend, to make the metric of achievement how much you spend as opposed to what's the outcome. And because right now we're out of the ability to spend infinite sums of money, and we actually have to choose how we spend it. If we have revenue to bail us out all the time, we're never going to make those choices.
Other comments? Yes.
Dave Penniman from SUNY. The answer to your question, is the stimulus a good thing or a bad thing? I believe the answer is yes. And the reason I say that is that if it's used for transformation, then I think it's a good thing. But if it's used, as it has been up to now, as for status quo, it's a bad thing. Now, that seems like a simple answer, but getting it to the side where it's actually transformational is not simple.
A thought on that, John, which is kind of like my way of reenacting the old Monty Python skit, I'm here to have an argument. The theory behind stimulus, and Nick, you advanced, I think, this argument for continuing stimulus. The theory, and it was a certain rationale to it, was states are encountering these massive economic problems, increase in unemployed, people are out of jobs. there's going to be more demand on them for services, particularly Medicaid. Therefore, the main spigot through which we're going to pour stimulus is going to be Medicaid and the so-called FMAP. That is, we're going to temporarily increase the reimbursement rate for Medicaid. Now, there was a rationale behind that. The economy's in a shambles, people are in need, more people will be on the Medicaid rolls. Here's more money for Medicaid. That was the thought. In fact, some version of that is actually advocated, unless I read it too quickly, in the GAO's own paper on long-term fiscal problems and what ought to be done as an automatic trigger. The problem is, I would suggest, is that that's exactly the wrong approach and the wrong program. And here's why, and this is the argument as it unfolds in New York, and I guess I have to assume everywhere else. Not only did they specifically have maintenance of effort requirements and strings attached that prevented you from doing Medicaid reforms that touched eligibility, but by increasing the Medicaid reimbursement rate, they raised the stakes negatively of doing any Medicaid change. So the argument became, well, Governor, Patterson's running this repeatedly. If Patterson proposed $100 million savings in Medicaid in any given area, people would say, well, the total cost of that, though, will be X, because particularly next year when we're getting reimbursed for it. In other words, Medicaid is always expanded by the amount of added federal funding available for it. I think that in retrospect, I would argue or suggest, propose, that it was precisely the wrong way to do it, and that if you're going to do anything else, that rule number one, and I would prefer they do as little as possible at this point, but that rule number one should be no strings attached, and almost back to the Nixonian approach, which Dick will appreciate, of revenue, just a block grant of money. Here, this is to tide you over, do what you can, it disappears in 4 quarters or 5 quarters.
Well, no, I think that's slightly mischaracterizing what I would
sorry,
say about. No, it's okay. I mean, the reason. Well, let me back up. The reason we have budget gaps, but the budget gaps are bad for the economy. I think almost everyone would agree that the actions that states have to take to balance their budget in a high unemployment economy worsen the macroeconomic picture because they're either raising taxes or they're cutting spending. Yes, there are different gradations of, well, is an employee, is it better to furlough employees or lay them off or give some a pay raise and lay others off? Exactly how any of those actions, frankly, is going to be bad for the economy. Freezing pay, furloughing workers, whatever. So then the question is, what's an effective and fast way to get money into state budgets? FMAP is actually a very efficient way to do that. It's by far the largest existing stream of federal payments to states. It works relatively automatically. The actual initial enactment was actually enacted in February, retroactive to the last quarter of the previous year, because it was just a simple mathematical change, and states could draw down significantly more money. And it was able to be somewhat targeted to states with high unemployment, where presumably it would have more of the macroeconomic benefits. It did have a maintenance of effort provision, which I think arguably that then ties into healthcare reform, where the goal is to get more people covered rather than fewer. The experience in the last recession was that budget gaps lead to people throwing people off of the Medicaid rolls, and Congress didn't want that to happen at the same time they were giving states more money. So, I think it's a nice idea to tie it to reforms, but we're in kind of, and a year ago even more so, but still today, we're in a continuing deep recession in which, frankly, I don't think we have time to design big new programs of federal intervention into how states manage their budget affairs. I just don't think it's that meets in any way the criteria of timely or targeted that David Walker mentioned earlier.
Yes.
I think layering issue is important. I don't think layering per se is necessarily efficient. The problem becomes not particularly good at selecting. Pressed. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was already pressed. It was on already. So. Yeah, we're not particularly good at managing these layers. Our entitlements often produce very expanded program that is used to pay for a lot of functions that are perhaps not anticipated.
We have some things like TANF block grants and training programs with performance requirements that often don't produce the kinds of results and targeting that we expect them to have, and have side effects that we may not like. So it's very difficult to manage these layers, and I think the technology, if we can develop better ways of managing these relationships, that would be much better. I mean, I would expect that some places like Wisconsin, for example, in managing their TANF programs internally between state and local governments is better than in a lot of states that have local administration. So it's, but I agree that the layering issue is an important one, but I don't think layers per se are a problem, but we need to handle them better.
Yes.
Hi. I've also been puzzled by the
Could you identify yourself, please?
Yeah, David Belkin from the Independent Budget Office, New York City. I've also been puzzled by the rapid transition from those apparent large positive balances in the state budget accounts to these huge gaps that have, opened up only within a year, and which leads me to think that if we were going to attach a string to any stimulus, it might involve stress testing state fiscal systems to see what their real capacity is, to what the real volatility risks are, and maybe require them to set up something realistic to be able to deal with that. And I guess there are a variety of other things that you could bring into the picture, like talking about pay-going capital in boom times, so that you can then draw that down without having an overall counter-cyclical position when you have a recession. And there are a variety of things you can do, but you can require states to pay back the money that you give them in a stimulus as a way of. It's being done with some other recipients of aid in this crisis, which would be a way of preventing states from just locking that money into spending, which is long-term unsustainable. But in any case, I think the stress test notion, I don't know if it's practical to do, but given the fact that those balances disappeared so fast, it seems to me that it's something that we need to know about.
Yeah, just one comment, and then Bob, you can tell me where we're going next. I think one of the answers to why in New York State the fund balances disappeared so quickly is we have a legislature with a philosophy of no dollar left behind. Bob, what's next? Did you have somebody you were calling on?
Yeah, I just had a brief question turning back to the question of taxation. From a macroeconomic point of view, is there any consensus as to what would constitute an optimal or sustainable level of taxation at the state and local level from, as expressed as a percentage of state GDP? In other words, what would be a level of taxation in relation to state GDP that would be, from an economic point of view, sustainable over the long term? And why shouldn't we use that, if there is such a consensus, to back into our analysis of how we should tax and where we should tax and so forth?
I think it would depend on what the mix is in your GDP. If you look at New York's GDP, it has an outrageously large financial sector in it. If you looked at the Texas GDP, it would look different, to cite two big GDPs. And so it's a very interesting question. I don't know whether it can't be answered or whether it's not quite the right question, because I don't know if there's an optimal level per percentage of GDP necessarily that doesn't take account of regional differences in the regional competitive situation and in the mix of the economy.
I think it also depends a lot on what the tax dollars are paying for. I mean, if you make the case that the tax dollars are paying for services that have long-term economic benefits, that, you know, up to that point, it would be reasonable to pay that level of taxes, and if not, it would have to be lower.
If you look at the data in terms of total state and local revenues, because on the spending side, you get all this noise because there's money moving between the levels of government. But if you take state and local revenues and tune out a little bit of the noise that you find in there, if you look back over time, all the way back to the Depression, you find that the cost of state and local government is almost flat at about 15% until you get to the 1980s. And then it has steadily increased and has now punched through 20%, and is continuing to sort of migrate upward. So I think one of the things to do is to sort of look at those kinds of measures. But as we came back and we got a round of applause for John Traylor, you know, we have all this transparency. We put all those numbers out there, and yet why hasn't it helped? I mean, the speakers this morning talked about transparency is an important public lever. Why hasn't it worked in New York?
Well, that's probably a long discussion, perhaps for another day. I'll invite Howard Turner to make one quick comment if you wanted to.
Yeah, I just want to support Nick on the, I think on the raising the Medicaid match as a means of providing stimulus. First of all, there's a political feasibility. General revenue sharing, establishing it was never going to happen. Second of all, we eliminated a major avenue for automatic stimulus, which was through the AFDC matching program. So that couldn't happen. And thirdly, the evidence suggests that in spite of the maintenance of effort requirement and the apparent targeting of this stimulus money, that in fact it works largely like general revenue sharing. I'm just reviewing a paper that shows this now, but in fact is better than general revenue sharing because of what we call the flypaper effect, that more of the money is staying in the state sector than would go to tax relief under a comparable general revenue sharing. So combining kind of fiscal response, political feasibility, as Nick described very nicely, this was the best policy you could do.
Thank you. Comments on that by any of the panelists? Or if not, we'll close, and thank you very much.